Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a journey back to the cold, dark winters of medieval Scandinavia, where survival wasn't just a matter of bravery or strength, it was about preparation, cooperation, and an almost stubborn refusal to let the elements win. We're talking about Viking peasants, the ordinary farmers and fishermen who made up the vast majority of Norse society, people whose names you'll never find in the sagas, but whose daily struggles and small victories built the foundation of an entire civilization. From the art of preserving enough food to last through 6 months of darkness, to the surprisingly sophisticated methods they used to keep their homes warm without burning through all their fuel by January, their story is one of resilience, ingenuity, and a deep understanding of the natural world around them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself settled in, and let's journey back to 9th century Norway, where a farmer named Bjorn, not the Bjorn, just a Bjorn, because there were a lot of them, is standing outside his longhouse in late October, looking at the sky with the kind of expression that says he knows exactly what's coming, and he's not particularly thrilled about it. Chapter 1. The approaching darkness. By late October, a Viking farmer didn't need a calendar to know winter was coming. The land itself told him everything he needed to know. The days had been shortening at an alarming rate for weeks now, each sunset arriving a little earlier, each sunrise delayed a little longer, until the world seemed caught in a perpetual twilight that turned everything soft and grey. The geese had left weeks ago, their V-shaped formations disappearing southward with a certainty that felt almost accusatory, as if they were saying, "Good luck with that," to everyone foolish enough to stay behind. The trees that weren't evergreens had already dropped their leaves, leaving skeletal branches that rattled in the wind like bones, and the grass had taken on that particular dead brown colour that meant it wouldn't be green again until April at the earliest. Our farmer Bjorn would have been watching all of this with the attention of someone whose life literally depended on reading nature's signals correctly. The thickness of animal fur that autumn, the behaviour of birds, the intensity of the aurora borealis, the patterns of frost on the ground in the morning, all of these things told a story about what kind of winter was coming. A mild winter meant survival would be merely difficult. A harsh winter meant that some families in the valley might not see spring. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no single day when winter arrived. It was more like a gradual tightening of a rope around the neck of the world, a slow constriction that happened so gradually you almost didn't notice until suddenly you were in the middle of it and there was no way out but forward. The animals knew it too. The cows had grown their thick winter coats, looking almost comically fluffy compared to their sleek summer appearance. The pigs had gotten fat, which was good, because several of them would need to be slaughtered before the coldest months. There was no point in feeding animals through winter that you were going to eat anyway, and fresh pork was a luxury that would only last a few days before it had to be preserved. The chickens had slowed their laying, conserving their energy for survival rather than production. And the few sheep that hadn't been brought down from the summer pastures yet were making their displeasure known with constant bleating that echoed across the valley like a chorus of complaints. The last of the root vegetables needed to come out of the ground before the first hard freeze, which could happen any day now. Turnips mostly. Endless, boring turnips that would form the backbone of the winter diet along with whatever grain they'd managed to harvest back in August. Bjorn and his family would have spent these late October days on their knees in the cold soil, pulling up every last turnip, every last onion, every last pathetic carrot that had somehow survived the short growing season. Their hands would have been raw and cracked, their backs aching, their knees caked in cold mud. But there was a certain meditative quality to it, a rhythm that came from knowing that every single vegetable counted, that the difference between comfort and hunger might come down to whether or not you bothered to dig up that last row. The root cellar beneath the Longhouse would have been filling up, slowly but surely, with bushels of turnips packed in sand, onions braided and hanging from the rafters, carrots stored in boxes of slightly damp earth to keep them from shriveling. It wasn't glamorous work. In fact, it was about as far from the popular image of Vikings as you could get. But it was the work that kept people alive. The sagas don't talk about this part. They don't mention the way a farmer's wife would organize her root cellar with the precision of a military campaign, putting the vegetables that would keep longest in the back, the ones that needed to be eaten first near the front, creating a system that would ensure a steady supply of food rather than feast and famine. There were other preparations too. Firewood, mountains of it, needed to be split and stacked. The ideal was to have enough wood to last through the entire winter without having to venture out into the worst weather to cut more, which meant accumulating truly staggering amounts of the stuff. A single household might go through several cords of wood in a harsh winter, and every log had to be cut, split, hauled, and stacked by hand. The sound of axes splitting wood would have been a constant background noise in every village during these weeks, a rhythmic thunking that started before dawn and continued until after sunset, as every able-bodied person tried to squeeze in just a few more logs before the snow made the work impossible. But survival wasn't just about physical preparation, it was also about social preparation. Winter in a Viking community wasn't a time for solitude. It was a time for consolidation, for drawing together, for remembering that humans are social animals who do better in groups than alone. Bjorn would have been making the rounds to his neighbours, checking in, making sure everyone had what they needed, because the harsh reality was that if your neighbour starved, it weakened the entire community. If Olaf's family ran out of food in February, they'd become a burden on everyone else, which meant it was in everyone's interest to make sure Olaf was properly prepared now. These weren't purely altruistic visits, of course. There was an element of social surveillance to them, a way of checking that everyone was pulling their weight and meeting their obligations to the community. The Viking world ran on a complex web of reciprocal obligations. You helped your neighbour now because you might need their help later, and everyone kept a careful mental accounting of who owed what to whom. If you knew that Eric the Lazy hadn't bothered to fix his roof properly and would probably need help when the first heavy snow collapsed it, well, you might have some pointed comments to make about responsibility and preparation. There would also be discussions about the more vulnerable members of the community, the elderly, the widowed, the sick. A widow with small children couldn't possibly cut enough firewood or bring in a full harvest on her own, which meant the community had to step in. Sometimes this was formalized through something like fostering, where a family would take in someone else's children for the winter in exchange for their labor in summer. Other times it was more informal, a rotation of neighbors who'd check in, drop off supplies, help with heavy work. It wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was survival strategy, a recognition that the community was only as strong as its weakest member. There was also a psychological preparation that happened during this time, a mental and emotional shift from the expansiveness of summer to the contracted world of winter. During summer, a Viking farmer's world was large. He might travel to distant fields, take his animals to far pastures, visit markets or things, assemblies, that were days away. But winter compressed that world down to the space you could walk in a day, and often much less than that. Your world became your farm, your longhouse, your immediate neighbours. The horizon shrank along with the daylight. This psychological compression required its own kind of adjustment. Families that got along reasonably well when everyone had space to spread out and separate tasks to do would be spending the next several months in very close quarters, sharing the same smoky air, sleeping in the same room, eating the same meals day after day after day. The potential for conflict was enormous, which is probably why Viking culture placed such emphasis on self-control, on keeping your temper, on swallowing your irritation and maintaining the peace. A family that fell apart into feuding and argument during the winter wasn't just creating personal unhappiness, they were threatening their own survival. So Bjorn, standing outside his longhouse in late October, wasn't just preparing his food stores and his firewood. He was preparing his mind, steeling himself for the long dark ahead, reminding himself that this was temporary, that spring would come eventually, that humans had survived thousands of these winters before, and he would survive this one too. The alternative, despair, giving up, deciding it wasn't worth the effort, wasn't really an option. You prepared, you endured, and you survived. That was the Viking peasant way, and it had worked for generations. No reason to think it would stop working now. Chapter 2. The Longhouse, Architecture of Survival. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a building, it was a survival machine, a carefully designed piece of technology that represented generations of accumulated knowledge about how to keep humans and animals alive through a Scandinavian winter. Picture a long rectangular structure, anywhere from 40 to 80 feet in length, depending on the wealth and size of the family, with walls that curved slightly outward to give the whole building a subtle boat-like shape. This wasn't aesthetic choice, it was engineering. That curve helped distribute the weight of snow that would pile up on the roof, preventing collapse, and it also helped deflect wind, reducing the force that battered against the walls during winter storms. The walls themselves were typically built using a post and plank method, where large vertical posts were sunk into the ground and then horizontal planks were fitted between them, creating a framework that was both sturdy and relatively easy to repair if something broke. The gaps between the planks were filled with whatever insulating material was available: moss, turf, clay mixed with animal hair, sometimes even seaweed if you lived near the coast. The goal was to create as many layers as possible between the inside and the outside, because each layer, no matter how thin, added to the overall insulation value of the wall. The roof was the most critical part of the whole structure, and Viking builders knew it. A typical longhouse roof would have a steep pitch, critical for shedding snow and rain, and was usually made of wooden shingles or planks covered with a thick layer of turf. And when I say thick, I mean thick. Sometimes a foot or more of packed earth and growing grass, which sounds insane until you realize that turf is actually an incredibly effective insulator. It keeps heat in during winter and keeps the house cool in summer. It's naturally waterproof once the grass roots have bound it together, and it provides an extra layer of weight that helps hold the whole structure down during storms. The downside? It's incredibly heavy, which meant the roof supports had to be substantial, usually massive oak timbers that could handle the load without sagging or breaking. Step inside a typical Viking longhouse in winter, and you'd find yourself in what was essentially one large room divided by function rather than by walls. The center of the longhouse was dominated by a long fire pit, not a fireplace built into a wall, but an actual trench dug into the dirt floor, sometimes lined with stones, where the main fire burned continuously throughout the winter months. This fire was the heart of the home in both literal and metaphorical senses. It provided warmth, light, cooking heat, and served as the social center around which family life revolved. On either side of the central fire pit were raised platforms or benches, covered with furs and textiles, where people would sit during the day and sleep at night. These weren't individual beds in the modern sense. They were more like communal sleeping areas where the entire family would pile together, using their combined body heat as an additional source of warmth. The social dynamics of who slept where were carefully calibrated. The head of the household and his wife would typically occupy the central position, with children and other family members arranged by age and status. The warmest spots were reserved for the very young and very old, those most vulnerable to the cold. At one end of the longhouse, separated from the main living area by some kind of partition, maybe wooden, maybe just a heavy curtain, would be the space for animals. Yes, animals lived in the house during winter, and before you recoil in horror at the thought of sharing your living space with cows and sheep, consider the practical reality. Animals generate an enormous amount of body heat, and in a world without central heating, any heat source was valuable. A cow is essentially a large breathing furnace that produces warmth continuously. And when you're trying to survive temperatures well below freezing, you don't turn down free heat just because it comes with a certain agricultural aroma. Now, here's where we need to talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the smoke in the longhouse. That central fire pit, burning continuously for months, had to go somewhere, and the answer was up. Sort of. Eventually. The smoke would rise from the fire and collect in the upper part of the longhouse before gradually filtering out through gaps in the roof, through the turf, through whatever holes and cracks existed in the structure. There was no chimney in the modern sense, no direct pipe carrying smoke efficiently away. Instead, the whole upper portion of the longhouse was basically a smoke layer, thick and grey, hanging like a cloud above the living space. This sounds absolutely miserable, and in many ways it was. The smoke irritated eyes and lungs. It blackened everything it touched. It made breathing difficult if you stood up too quickly into the thicker layers. But it also had some unexpected benefits. The smoke helped preserve food that was hung from the rafters. Fish, meat, cheese would last longer when constantly bathed in smoke. It also helped preserve the wood of the structure itself, acting as a kind of pesticide that discouraged insects and prevented rot. And perhaps most importantly, once you adapted to it, and your body did adapt, your eyes stopped watering quite so much, your cough became less persistent. The smoke created a kind of atmospheric buffer, a layer of warmer air that helped retain heat in the lower part of the room where people actually lived. The trick was to keep the fire at the right level, hot enough to provide warmth and light, but not so hot that it produced excessive smoke or consumed wood too quickly. This was an art form, passed down from generation to generation, a skill that separated the competent housewife from the incompetent one. You learned to read the fire, to know when it needed another log, when it needed to be stirred, when it needed to be damped down for the night. You learned which woods burned hot and fast, which burned slow and steady, which produced more smoke and which produced more heat. You learn to arrange the logs in specific patterns to control airflow and combustion rate. But the longhouse itself, as well designed as it was, still wasn't enough to keep a family comfortable through the worst of winter without additional strategies. One of the most important was the use of interior textiles. Heavy woolen hangings, sometimes called tapestries, though that implies a level of decoration that most peasant households couldn't afford, that were hung from the walls and ceiling to create an inner layer of insulation. These textiles did double duty. They helped trap warm air close to the living space, creating a buffer zone between the inhabited area and the cold walls. And they also reduced drafts by covering gaps and cracks in the wood. The floor itself was another area where insulation mattered. A dirt floor, especially frozen dirt, radiates cold upward, making the whole space feel chilly no matter how well you heat the air. The Viking solution was layers. First, perhaps a base layer of gravel or small stones for drainage, then packed earth, then layers of rushes or straw that could be refreshed periodically, then sheepskins or woolen rugs in the areas where people actually sat and slept. This created a multi-layered floor that provided both insulation and a degree of comfort, though comfort is obviously a relative term when we're talking about sleeping on what was essentially a slightly padded dirt surface. Windows were a problem. Glass was rare and expensive, far beyond the means of a typical peasant household. But you couldn't have a building with no openings at all, or the smoke would never escape, and the interior would become unlivable. The solution was small openings, high up near the roofline, sometimes covered with thin sheets of scraped animal membrane that allowed some light through while blocking wind. Sometimes covered with wooden shutters that could be opened on milder days and closed tight during storms. These openings were deliberately small and deliberately positioned to minimize heat loss while still providing necessary ventilation. The longhouse wasn't a static structure that you built once and then forgot about. It required constant maintenance, especially during winter. Snow would pile up on the roof, and while the turf covering could handle a certain amount of weight, there was a limit. Someone had to go up there periodically and shovel off the excess. A cold, dangerous job that nevertheless had to be done, unless you wanted to risk the entire roof collapsing in the middle of the night. Ice would form around the edges of the roof, creating dams that could trap water and lead to leaks, so those had to be knocked away. Cracks would develop in the walls as wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and those needed to be patched with fresh moss or clay before they became major drafts. Inside, the fire pit needed constant attention. The ashes had to be cleared out regularly, or they'd build up and smother the fire. The stones lining the pit would crack and break under the constant heating and cooling, and had to be replaced. The sleeping platforms needed fresh straw and fur. The animal area needed to be mucked out. You couldn't just let the manure pile up all winter, both because of the smell and because the ammonia it produced was genuinely harmful. So even in the coldest weather, even when venturing outside was unpleasant, someone had to shovel out the cow area and haul the frozen manure to the muck heap outside. It wasn't exciting work. It wasn't the stuff of sagas and legends, but it was the work that kept the longhouse functional, that kept the survival machine running through the long, dark months. Bjorn and his family would have had a routine, a schedule of maintenance tasks that got done every day regardless of weather, regardless of how anyone felt about it. The fire got tended, the animals got fed, the floors got swept, the roof got checked. Day after day, week after week, month after month. Boring, repetitive, absolutely essential. Chapter 3. Food Preservation. The Art of Not Starving. Let's talk about the cold, hard arithmetic of Viking winter survival, because at its core, that's what it was. A math problem. You had X number of people and animals to feed. You had Y amount of food that you'd manage to produce, hunt, gather, or trade for during the warmer months. And you had Z number of days, somewhere between 150 and 180, depending on how early winter came and how late spring arrived, during which productive food gathering was basically impossible. The equation was brutally simple. If Y divided by Z wasn't enough to feed X, somebody was going to go hungry. And if the shortage was severe enough, somebody was going to die. This wasn't abstract theorizing for Viking peasants. It was the reality that shaped every decision they made from early spring onward. How much land to plant? How many animals to keep versus slaughter? How much fish to catch and preserve? How much wild food to gather? Every choice cascaded forward to that moment in late October, when you looked at your stores and either felt a sense of relief or a creeping dread in your stomach. Bjorn, standing in his storage area doing a mental inventory, would have been running these calculations constantly, adjusting and readjusting based on how many mouths he had to feed, how harsh he thought the winter would be, how much he might need to set aside for planting in spring. The goal wasn't abundance. That was a fantasy beyond reach for most families. The goal was sufficiency with a small margin for error, enough to get everyone through winter without serious malnutrition and with seed grain left over for planting. If you managed that, you'd succeeded. If you had surplus beyond that, well, surplus meant security, meant you could trade, meant you could help neighbors who'd fallen short, meant you could afford to take a risk on expanding your operation next year. But for most families, most years, sufficiency was the best they could hope for. Grain was the foundation of everything. Barley mostly, some oats, occasionally rye if you were in the right climate for it. This wasn't the refined white flour of modern bread. This was whole grain that still had all its oils and nutrients, which meant it was more nutritious, but also meant it was more prone to spoilage. A Viking family's grain supply represented months of labor. Ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, winnowing. And it all had to be stored in a way that would keep it edible until the following summer. The storage solutions were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Large ceramic pots, their interiors sometimes coated with beeswax or pine tar to create a moisture barrier. Wooden barrels with tight-fitting lids, stored off the ground on platforms to prevent moisture from seeping up. Leather bags hung from rafters where mice couldn't easily reach them. Each container represented a calculated risk. Put all your grain in one place and a single disaster could wipe you out. But spread it too thin and you couldn't monitor it effectively for signs of mold or pest infestation. The grain had to stay dry above all else. Moisture meant mold, and moldy grain could kill you as surely as no grain at all. Certain molds produce toxins that cause illness, organ damage, even death. So families would check their grain stores regularly, looking for any signs of dampness, any musty smell that indicated problems developing. If you caught it early enough, you could sometimes save the grain by spreading it out to dry, picking through it to remove the affected kernels. Catch it too late and you'd lose the entire container, which could mean the difference between a hungry spring and a catastrophic one. Rationing was both an art and a source of constant tension. The woman of the household, let's call her Astrid, Bjorn's wife, would have been in charge of doling out the grain each day, grinding what was needed for that day's bread or porridge and no more. She would have kept a mental tally of what remained and how fast it was being consumed, adjusting portion sizes as necessary to make sure they didn't run out before spring. This made her simultaneously the most important person in the household and, potentially, the most resented. Because she was the one saying, "No, you can't have more. This has to last." Fresh meat was a luxury that existed only briefly, in the days immediately after an animal was slaughtered. After that, everything had to be preserved, and the Vikings had developed a whole arsenal of preservation techniques, each suited to different types of meat and different storage conditions. Salt curing, smoking, drying, sometimes pickling in whey or brine. Each method had its advantages and disadvantages, its ideal applications and its limitations. Salting meat was effective but required salt, which wasn't free. If you lived near the coast, you could make salt by boiling seawater, a tedious process that consumed enormous amounts of fuel for relatively small amounts of salt. But at least it was possible. Inland, salt had to be traded for, making it a valuable commodity that you used carefully. The process itself was straightforward enough. You'd pack the meat in layers of salt, making sure every surface was covered, and the salt would draw out moisture while preventing bacterial growth. The result was meat that would keep for months, though it was so salty that it had to be soaked in water before cooking, or it would be nearly inedible. Smoking was another option, particularly good for fish. The Longhouse's smoky interior actually helped with this. You could hang fish from the rafters near the fire, letting them slowly dry and smoke over the course of weeks. The smoke acted as a preservative, the heat helped drive out moisture, and the result was a hard, dry fish that would keep almost indefinitely. It wasn't delicate or flavorful, but it was protein. And in the middle of winter, that's what counted. Smoked fish could be eaten as is, or more commonly, it would be broken into pieces and added to soups and stews, where it would rehydrate and contribute both protein and a smoky flavor to the dish. Drying meat in thin strips, what we might call jerky, was effective in the cold, dry air of autumn. But once winter set in with its higher humidity from snow and ice, drying became less reliable. The meat would be cut into thin strips, sometimes seasoned with salt if it was available, and hung in a place with good air circulation, often outside under a covered area where it would stay cold but dry. The cold temperatures inhibited bacterial growth, while the air circulation prevented mold. The result was a lightweight, portable protein source that could be eaten as is or rehydrated in cooking. For families with cows or goats, milk was a valuable resource that presented its own preservation challenges. Fresh milk spoiled within hours in warm weather and only a bit longer in cold, so the key was transforming it into something more stable. Cheese was the primary solution, taking milk, adding rennet to curdle it, pressing out the whey, and creating a solid mass that would keep for months. Viking cheese wasn't the aged, complex cheeses of later European tradition. It was simpler, often quite hard, sometimes smoked for additional preservation, always practical rather than refined. The cheese-making process would have been a regular part of autumn preparation, as families processed as much milk as possible before the cow's production dropped off in winter. The whey left over from cheese-making wasn't wasted. It could be drunk fresh, used in cooking, or even allowed to ferment slightly to create a sour but nutritious beverage that would keep longer than fresh milk. Some families also made a product called skyr, a cultured dairy product somewhere between yogurt and cheese, thick and sour and remarkably long-lasting when kept cool. Butter was another preservation strategy. Fresh butter is wonderful but perishable. Salted butter, packed tightly in containers to exclude air, could last through winter. Some families would go further, making what's sometimes called bog butter. Butter packed in wooden containers and buried in peat bogs, where the cool, acidic, anaerobic conditions could preserve it for months or even years. The result wasn't particularly pleasant tasting compared to fresh butter, but it was fat and calories when you needed them, and that was worth more than refined flavor. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth going into more detail because root vegetables were genuinely critical to winter survival. They weren't exciting. Turnips, onions, carrots, maybe some parsnips if you were lucky. But they provided vitamins, minerals, and bulk to fill empty stomachs when grain supplies were running low. The challenge was keeping them fresh without refrigeration, and the solutions Viking families developed were clever in their simplicity. The root cellar under the Longhouse was essentially a hole dug below the frost line, where temperatures stayed relatively constant. Cold enough to inhibit spoilage, but not so cold that vegetables would freeze and turn to mush. The vegetables would be layered in sand or dry soil, which helped regulate moisture and prevented them from touching each other, reducing the spread of rot if one went bad. The cellar needed to be checked regularly, with any spoiling vegetables removed immediately before they could contaminate their neighbors. Different vegetables had different storage requirements and different shelf lives. Onions and garlic, if kept dry, could last almost the entire winter. Turnips and carrots could last for months under the right conditions, but needed to be checked for signs of sprouting or softening. Cabbages could be kept in the cellar or sometimes buried outside in straw-lined pits. Nothing was wasted. If a turnip started to go soft, it got used in the next day's stew. If an onion sprouted, you could eat the sprouts as greens. The goal was to work through your stores systematically, using the least stable items first and saving the ones that would keep longest for late winter and early spring. Even in winter, the land provided some food if you knew where to look and were willing to work for it. Certain types of seaweed could be gathered from ice-free coastal areas, providing vitamins and minerals that were otherwise scarce in the winter diet. Ice fishing was possible on frozen lakes and rivers, though it was cold, often unproductive work. You'd spend hours sitting over a hole in the ice, waiting for fish that might or might not come. But the potential reward was worth the discomfort. Some families would set fish traps under the ice, checking them periodically, hoping to find something caught. In the forests, if snow conditions allowed travel, there were resources to be gathered. Pine and spruce needles could be made into a tea that provided vitamin C, helping prevent scurvy. Certain types of bark could be ground up and added to flour to stretch grain supplies. Not nutritious, but filling, and sometimes filling was enough. Some families would dig for roots even in winter, following remembered locations of edible plants from summer, digging through snow and frozen soil for anything that might be there. Birds could be trapped or snared, though winter birds were scarce and wary. Small game like rabbits and hares could be hunted, their white winter coats making them challenging to spot against snow, but their tracks giving away their presence. These weren't major food sources. Nobody was surviving the winter primarily on trapped rabbits, but they were supplements, small additions to the diet that provided variety and additional protein when luck was on your side. Chapter 4. Daily Routines. The Rhythm of Winter Days. Winter morning in 9th century Norway arrived less as a distinct event and more as a gradual lessening of darkness, a shift from complete black to a dim grey that passed for daylight in the northern latitudes. In the depths of winter, the sun might not actually rise at all in the far north, or might make only a brief appearance, scraping along the southern horizon for a few hours before disappearing again. For Bjorn's family, waking wasn't triggered by sunlight streaming through windows, but by internal rhythms and practical necessity. The fire needed tending, the animals needed feeding, and lying in bed using up precious body heat without accomplishing anything wasn't an option. The first person up was usually whoever was in charge of the fire, often a child or young person, since this was an important but relatively simple task that could be delegated. The fire would have been damped down for the night, covered with ash to slow its burning, but it should still have had living coals underneath. Uncovering those coals, adding small kindling, blowing gently to encourage flames, gradually building the fire back up to a useful level. This was the process that marked the beginning of each day, the rekindling that brought warmth and light back into the cold, dark longhouse. As the fire came back to life, others would begin to stir, emerging from the pile of furs and blankets on the sleeping platforms, moving slowly because the air was cold and movement required motivation. There was no privacy in this process. Everyone was waking up together in the same space, stretching, yawning, attending to bodily needs in whatever designated area existed for that purpose. The elderly and very young would be given priority for the warmest spots near the revived fire, while the able-bodied would begin their morning tasks while still half asleep, moving through routines so ingrained they didn't require full consciousness. The animals couldn't wait. Cows needed milking even in winter, though their production would have dropped significantly from summer levels. The goats needed the same. The sheep needed checking to make sure none had gotten tangled or injured during the night. The chickens needed to have their frozen water replaced with something drinkable, a constant winter task, carrying water from wherever you were keeping it, knowing that it would freeze again within hours and you'd have to do it all over again. The pigs needed feeding, the horses needed feeding, and all the animals needed someone to muck out their area and spread fresh straw or hay. This work fell to whoever was available, but usually there was a rough division of labor. Women typically handled milking and poultry. Men handled larger animals and the heavier work of mucking out stalls and hauling manure. Children helped with everything, learning the skills they'd need when they ran their own household someday. The work was cold, often uncomfortable, occasionally disgusting, but it was also familiar, and there was something almost meditative about it, the same motions repeated day after day, your hands knowing what to do even when your mind was elsewhere. The milk from the morning milking would be taken inside, strained through cloth to remove any dirt or debris, and then either drunk fresh, a luxury in winter, or set aside to be made into cheese or skyr. Some might be added to porridge if the family felt prosperous enough to spare it, making the morning meal richer and more filling. The amount of milk varied depending on how well fed the cows were, and in deep winter, when the stored hay was starting to run low, milk production could drop to a trickle, making each cup more precious. Breakfast, such as it was, centered around porridge, grain cooked with water or milk into a thick, filling mass that stuck to your ribs and provided energy for the day's work. Astrid would have been in charge of this, measuring out the day's ration of grain, grinding it if necessary, though often it would have been ground in larger batches to save time, and cooking it over the fire in a large pot. The porridge might be flavoured with a bit of dried fruit if any remained, or some honey if the family had been lucky with their beehives, or more commonly with nothing at all except perhaps a pinch of salt. It was food as fuel, sustenance rather than cuisine, and complaining about it would have been seen as both ungracious and pointless. Everyone would eat from the same pot, using wooden bowls or sometimes just pieces of flat bread as edible plates, sitting around the fire for warmth while they ate. The meal was functional rather than social. People ate, got the calories they needed, and moved on to the day's tasks. There might be some conversation, discussion of what needed to be done that day, but this wasn't the leisurely breakfast of modern imagination. It was fuel stop, efficiency prioritized over enjoyment, because there was work to be done and daylight, such as it was, wouldn't last long. After breakfast came cleaning up, which mostly meant scraping out the porridge pot and giving it a quick rinse, hanging it to dry near the fire. Water was too precious to waste on elaborate washing, and besides, the pot would be used again for the next meal, so pristine cleanliness wasn't necessary. Bowls might be wiped clean with bread or cloth and stacked for reuse. Nothing was wasted. If there was any porridge left over, it would be saved for later, either to be eaten cold or added to the next meal. The concept of throwing away perfectly good food would have been almost incomprehensible to people who lived this close to the margin between sufficiency and hunger. With the animals tended and breakfast finished, the household would settle into the day's indoor work, because venturing outside in winter was something you did only when necessary. For the women, this meant an endless rotation of textile work, spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into fabric, sewing fabric into clothes, mending clothes that were worn or torn, knitting socks and mittens, creating all the textile goods that the family needed to stay warm and clothed. This wasn't occasional crafting. This was full-time work that consumed thousands of hours per year, and winter was actually the best time for it because you were stuck inside anyway with nothing better to do. The spinning was done with a drop spindle, a simple tool that consisted of a weight on a stick that used its own momentum to twist fibers into thread. It was work that could be done while doing other things. You could spin while supervising children, while chatting with neighbors who'd come to visit, while keeping an eye on the fire or the cooking pot. The motion became automatic, your hands working without conscious thought, pulling out fibers, spinning the spindle, winding up the thread, over and over and over. A skilled woman could produce a shocking amount of thread this way, though it took all her spare time. A concept that barely existed for Viking women, who were expected to always be productive, always be working on something. Weaving was more focused work that required the use of a loom, usually an upright warp-weighted loom that stood against one wall of the longhouse. The weaver would stand or sit at the loom, passing the weft thread back and forth through the warp threads, building up fabric row by row in a process that was both rhythmic and demanding. Good fabric was tight and even, with consistent tension throughout, which required skill and attention. Poor fabric would be loose, uneven, prone to wearing out quickly, acceptable for rough work clothes, but not for anything that needed to last, or that would be given as a gift or trade good. The men had their own indoor work, making and repairing tools, carving wooden implements, working with leather, maintaining weapons and equipment. Bjorn might spend a winter afternoon fixing a broken plough blade, carving new handles for tools, making wooden bowls or spoons to replace ones that had cracked, repairing a leather harness that had worn through. This was skilled work that required tools and knowledge, and the man who was clever with his hands could provide significant value to his household by keeping everything in good repair, without having to trade for replacements. The main meal of the day typically came in early afternoon, after most of the essential work was done. This was more substantial than breakfast, often some kind of stew made with preserved meat or fish, root vegetables, possibly some dried legumes if the family had them, all cooked together in a large pot that hung over the fire. The stew would simmer for hours, making tough preserved meat tender, blending flavors, filling the Longhouse with smells that were probably quite welcome after months of the same diet. Bread might be baked if there was fuel to spare. Flat rounds of barley bread cooked on hot stones near the fire, or sometimes baked directly in the ashes and then brushed clean. This bread was dense and heavy. Nothing like the fluffy wheat bread of modern bakeries, but it was filling and could be used to sop up stew or spread with butter or cheese. Some families baked bread daily, others less frequently, depending on their fuel situation and grain supplies. There was always a calculation happening in the background. Is the fuel and labor required to bake bread worth the benefit, or should we just eat more porridge and save resources? After the meal, work resumed. There was always something to do. Clothes to mend, tools to repair, firewood to bring in from the outdoor pile, the floor to sweep, the fire to tend. Children might receive some informal education during these hours, learning skills from their parents, hearing stories and history passed down orally, since written literacy was rare among peasants. An older child might be practicing with weapons if they were male, or learning more advanced textile skills if they were female, preparing for their adult roles in the community. As what passed for daylight faded, and in deep winter this might happen by mid-afternoon, the household would gather around the fire for the evening meal, which was often lighter than the midday one, perhaps just more porridge or bread with cheese, something simple that didn't require much preparation or fuel. This was the most social time of day, when work was mostly done, and the family could sit together, talk, tell stories, share news and gossip. This was when the oral culture of the Vikings really came alive. Someone might recite poetry or tell stories, not the grand sagas of heroes and gods, though those certainly had their place, but more immediate stories about neighbors and relatives, about funny things that had happened, about local history and family lineage. These stories served multiple purposes. Entertainment, obviously, but also education, cultural transmission, the maintaining of social bonds. A family that stopped talking to each other during the long winter months was a family in trouble. Eventually, as the fire was damped down for the night and the cold began to creep back in, people would retreat to their sleeping platforms, piling on furs and blankets, huddling together for warmth. Sleep came easily to people who'd been working all day in cold conditions. There was no lying awake scrolling through devices, no ambient light pollution, no caffeine in your system. You were tired, it was dark, it was cold, and sleep was the body's natural response. The Longhouse would fall silent, except for the crackle of the damped fire, the breathing of sleeping people and animals, maybe the wind howling outside. And then, a few hours later, it would all begin again. Chapter 5. Clothing and Textiles, Layers of Survival. Let's be very clear about something. Without wool, Viking civilization as we know it couldn't have existed in Scandinavia. Wool was the technology that made life in cold climates possible. The material that stood between humans and hypothermia. And the Vikings understood this at a level that modern people with our synthetic fibers and central heating can barely comprehend. Wool wasn't just what you made clothes from. It was insulation, it was waterproofing, it was survival. And the production and processing of wool was one of the most important economic and practical activities of Viking life. Sheep were everywhere in the Viking world, not just because they provided meat and milk, though they did, but primarily because they provided wool. The sheep breeds that Vikings raised were typically what we'd now call primitive breeds, hardy animals that could survive on rough forage and harsh conditions, producing wool that was coarse and strong rather than soft and fine. This wasn't the merino wool of luxury sweaters. This was tough, durable fiber that could stand up to hard use and harsh weather. And that was exactly what was needed. The wool was sheared in spring, a massive community effort when the weather warmed enough that the sheep wouldn't freeze without their coats. The raw wool would be filthy, full of dirt, plant matter, lanolin, sometimes dried manure, and had to be cleaned before it could be used. This meant washing it repeatedly in water, picking out debris by hand, a tedious process that consumed days of labor, but was absolutely necessary. The clean wool would then be combed or carded to align the fibers, preparing it for spinning, and then the real work began. We talked earlier about women spinning thread, but it's worth understanding just how much spinning was required to clothe a single person, let alone an entire family. A simple tunic required several thousand yards of thread, not feet, yards. A cloak required even more, and every single yard of that thread had to be spun by hand, one drop spindle rotation at a time, by women and girls who spent literally thousands of hours per year just creating the raw material for clothing. The thread then had to be woven into fabric, another time-consuming process that required skill and attention. The typical Viking loom was vertical, with warp threads hanging down and held taut by clay or stone weights at the bottom. The weaver would pass the weft thread back and forth through the warp, creating fabric that built from the top down. A skilled weaver could produce maybe a few inches of fabric per day, depending on how wide the piece was and how fine the thread. A simple piece of fabric large enough for a tunic might take weeks to weave. And then there was the finishing, fulling the fabric by beating and washing it to make it denser and more weather resistant, sometimes treating it with various substances to make it more water repellent, cutting it into pattern pieces, sewing those pieces together with needle and thread, which, yes, also had to be spun by hand. The amount of labor that went into a single piece of clothing was staggering, which is why clothes were valuable, why they were repaired and mended and passed down and repurposed until they literally fell apart into rags, and why stripping clothes from the dead in battle was considered perfectly acceptable behavior. The Vikings didn't have a single thick coat that kept them warm. They had layers, multiple layers of wool clothing that trapped air and created insulation through depth rather than through any single high-tech material. The base layer would typically be a long linen or wool undertunic, worn next to the skin. Linen had the advantage of being washable without shrinking, though it didn't provide much warmth. Wool was warmer but harder to clean, so there was a trade-off. Over the undertunic would come the main tunic, usually made of wool, reaching to somewhere between the knee and mid-calf depending on fashion and practicality. This wasn't a fitted garment in the modern sense. It was relatively loose, allowing freedom of movement, and also allowing air circulation between layers, which was important because trapped air was what actually provided insulation. A too tight garment that compressed the wool defeated the purpose. Then came additional layers as needed, perhaps a second overtunic, perhaps a wool cloak or cape, perhaps a coat made of fur or sheepskin if the weather was particularly brutal or if you were going to be outside for extended periods. The cloak was particularly important. It was a large rectangular piece of wool fabric, often treated with lanolin or other fats to make it somewhat water resistant, that could be wrapped around the body in various ways depending on need. It served as a coat, a blanket, an emergency shelter, a ground cloth, whatever was needed. Your extremities were particularly vulnerable to cold, and protecting them was both crucial and challenging. Mittens were more effective than gloves at keeping hands warm because they allowed fingers to share heat, though gloves were better when you needed dexterity for specific tasks. Viking mittens were typically made of thick wool felt, sometimes with an outer layer of leather or fur for additional protection and durability. The wealthier families might have fur-lined mittens, with the fur on the inside providing extra warmth and luxury. Socks or leg wrappings were essential for keeping feet warm, but they were also problematic because feet sweat even in cold weather, and damp wool loses much of its insulating value. The solution was to have multiple pairs of socks so that you could change into dry ones regularly, hanging the damp ones near the fire to dry out before the next use. Footwear itself was typically leather, sometimes lined with wool or fur, cut high to keep snow out and provide ankle support. The leather would be treated with fats to make it water-resistant, though truly waterproof boots were beyond the available technology. Leg wrappings, long strips of wool fabric wound around the lower leg from ankle to knee, served multiple purposes. They provided warmth, obviously, but they also gave support to tired legs and ankles, protected against scratches and impacts, and could be wrapped tighter or looser depending on conditions. They were held in place with leather straps or cords, and like everything else, they had to be made by hand. Just more fabric to weave and more sewing to do. Clothing didn't last forever, not when you were wearing it constantly in rough conditions. Wool wore thin at stress points, elbows, knees, seats of trousers. Seams came apart, fabric tore or developed holes. And because producing new clothing was so labor-intensive, repair and maintenance were constant occupations. Women would spend winter evenings with needle and thread in hand, going over every piece of clothing the family owned, reinforcing weak areas before they failed completely, patching holes, darning thin spots, extending the usable life of garments by months or years. When a piece of clothing was truly beyond repair, worn so thin that patching was pointless, it wasn't thrown away. The fabric would be cut down and repurposed. Good sections might be used as patches for other garments. Scraps too small for patches could be used as cleaning rags or as stuffing for pillows and cushions. Truly worn-out fabric might be shredded and used as tinder for starting fires, or mixed with clay as a binding agent for construction. The idea of disposing of textile material that still had any use at all would have seemed insane to people who understood exactly how many hours of labor went into creating it. Washing wool clothing was problematic because wool shrinks and felts when agitated in hot water, so washing was done carefully and infrequently. A garment might be spot cleaned when it got particularly dirty, or brushed to remove loose dirt, or hung outside in cold weather where freezing temperatures would actually help kill bacteria and reduce odor. The smoke of the Longhouse probably helped too, acting as a kind of continuous low-level fumigation that inhibited the bacteria that cause smell. Did Viking peasants smell by modern standards? Absolutely. Did they care? Not particularly. Everyone smelled. It was just part of life. Special purpose clothing. Some situations required specialized clothing. Fishing or working in wet conditions meant needing outer garments that were as waterproof as possible, usually achieved by treating leather or wool with fish oil or animal fat, creating a barrier that would shed water for a while before eventually soaking through. These garments were stiff, often smelly, and not particularly comfortable, but they kept you drier than untreated fabric would, and that made them valuable. Sleeping in winter required its own considerations. You didn't sleep in your day clothes because they'd be damp from sweat and would make you cold during the night. Instead, you'd change into a sleeping tunic made of softer wool or linen, something that hadn't absorbed the day's moisture. The really cold nights might mean sleeping in wool socks and a wool cap, looking ridiculous but staying warmer. Blankets and furs piled on top provided the main insulation, creating a microclimate under the covers that could be quite warm, even when the air temperature in the Longhouse was barely above freezing. For work outside in the worst weather, bringing in firewood during a storm, checking on animals, whatever couldn't be postponed. You wanted the most protective layers you owned. That meant the cloak treated with fat for water resistance, mittens rather than gloves, leg wrappings pulled tight and secured well, a wool cap that covered your ears, maybe a scarf wrapped around your face to protect against wind and reduce the amount of freezing air you were breathing directly into your lungs. You still got cold doing outside work in winter, but proper clothing meant the difference between uncomfortable and genuinely dangerous. Chapter 6. Social Life and Entertainment. Human connection in the dark. The necessity of neighbors. Winter isolation wasn't just physically challenging, it was psychologically brutal. Humans are social creatures, and the Viking peasants understood that maintaining social connections during the long dark months wasn't just pleasant, it was essential for mental health and community cohesion. You couldn't just retreat into your longhouse in October and emerge in April without going somewhat insane. So despite the cold, despite the difficulty of travel, despite every practical reason to stay home, people made the effort to visit each other, to maintain the social bonds that held their communities together. These visits weren't the casual drop-ins of modern suburbia. Travel in winter, even short distances, required preparation and determination. You had to bundle up properly. You had to time your travel for whatever daylight existed. You had to be prepared for rapidly changing weather conditions. A trip to visit a neighbor who lived just a mile or two away could turn into a genuine ordeal if the weather shifted while you were traveling. But people did it anyway, because the alternative, complete isolation for months, was worse than the discomfort of cold travel. When visitors arrived at Bjorn's Longhouse, it was an event, a break in the routine that everyone welcomed, even if it meant crowding and disruption. The visitors would be greeted warmly, offered the best seats near the fire, given food and drink even if supplies were running low. Because hospitality was both a social expectation and a practical necessity. You treated your guests well because someday you'd be the guest at someone else's home, and you wanted to be treated well in return. It was reciprocity again. The fundamental principle that governs so much of Viking social interaction. Once the visitors were settled and the initial pleasantries exchanged, the real purpose of these gatherings would begin. Storytelling. This wasn't passive entertainment like watching television. It was an active, participatory experience where skilled storytellers would recite poems, tell tales, share news and gossip, and generally provide information and entertainment in a culture that had limited literacy and no mass media. The stories served multiple purposes simultaneously. They entertained, yes, but they also educated, transmitted cultural values, maintained historical memory, and reinforced social norms. The grand sagas, stories of heroes and gods, of legendary deeds and ancient history, were certainly told, particularly by professional skalds if you were lucky enough to have one visit. But for most ordinary gatherings, the stories were more immediate and personal. Family genealogies, because knowing who was related to whom was crucial for understanding social obligations and inheritance rights. Stories about local events, about funny things that had happened, about conflicts and their resolutions. cautionary tales about people who'd violated social norms and suffered consequences. Ghost stories and tales of the supernatural, because long dark nights naturally lent themselves to such things. Bjorn himself might tell stories about his own experiences. About that time he went trading in the next valley and encountered a particularly stubborn merchant. About the summer his cow gave birth to twins. About the winter storm that nearly destroyed his roof. These weren't grand heroic tales, but they were the fabric of community memory, the shared experiences that bound people together. Astrid might tell stories passed down from her grandmother, preserving family history across generations. The children would listen, absorbing not just the entertainment, but the cultural knowledge embedded in the stories. The telling itself was an art form. A good storyteller knew how to pace a narrative, when to pause for effect, how to use voice and gesture to bring characters to life. There were traditional story structures and formulaic phrases that helped both storyteller and audience, making it easier to remember long narratives without written text to reference. The audience wasn't passive. They'd respond, interject comments, sometimes challenge details or offer their own versions of events. It was interactive entertainment, requiring engagement from everyone involved. Music was another form of entertainment that helped pass the winter hours. Simple instruments, flutes made from bone or wood, lyres with a few strings, drums made from stretched animal hide, could produce enough sound to accompany singing or provide a rhythmic background for work. The music wasn't complex by modern standards, but complexity wasn't the point. The point was creating sound together, participating in something communal, breaking up the monotony of routine with organized noise. Songs served many of the same functions as stories. Some were narrative, telling tales in musical form. Others were work songs that helped coordinate labor and make repetitive tasks more bearable. Still others were purely social, songs everyone knew the words to, songs you could sing together around the fire. There were songs for specific occasions, harvest songs, wedding songs, drinking songs, lullabies for children. The melodies were simple enough that everyone could participate regardless of musical talent, because the goal wasn't performance excellence, but communal participation. Children would learn songs from their parents and grandparents, often before they could even understand all the words, absorbing melody and rhythm first and meaning later. Some songs were deliberately educational, containing information about seasonal cycles, about animal behavior, about practical skills, encoded in verse and melody so they'd be easier to remember. A song about when to plant different crops or how to predict weather might seem primitive, but it was an effective way of transmitting practical knowledge in a largely oral culture. Musical instruments themselves were often made during winter when there was time for such projects. A man with a talent for carving might spend several evenings working on a new flute, shaping the wood carefully, drilling the finger holes, testing and adjusting until the notes came out right. The process was meditative, and the result was something that would provide entertainment for years. Instruments were valuable, passed down through families, repaired when they broke rather than replaced, because they represented both significant labor investment and the accumulated memories of all the songs they'd played. Sitting and talking was fine, but Vikings were physically active people who needed outlets for energy even in winter. Indoor games provided some of this. Board games like Nefertafel, which was something like chess, but with different rules and objectives, were popular among those who could afford the game pieces. The game required strategy and planning, could occupy hours, and provided mental stimulation during the long dark days. Carved game pieces and boards have been found in archaeological excavations, testament to how important these games were to people. Dice games were popular too, often involving gambling with small stakes. Not enough to impoverish anyone, but enough to make the outcome matter. A game where you might lose a knife or win someone's spare mittens had more interest than a game with no stakes at all. Children played simpler games: knucklebones, catch, hide and seek in the shadows of the Longhouse. Anything that burned energy and kept them occupied. Parents had limited patience for bored children in close quarters, so anything that kept the kids entertained was encouraged. On days when the weather was tolerable, outdoor activities became possible. Wrestling matches between young men, more about demonstrating strength and skill than actually hurting anyone, provided entertainment for participants and spectators alike. Ice skating on frozen lakes or rivers using bone skates strapped to their feet was both practical transportation and entertainment. Skiing, though the early skis were much longer and narrower than modern ones, allowed travel over snow and also provided opportunities for racing and showing off. Target practice with bows continued even in winter, because skills needed maintaining and young men needed outlets for competitive energy. The targets might be set up in a protected area, and groups would gather to shoot, to critique each other's form, to bet on outcomes, to generally combine practical skill maintenance with social interaction. Axes and spears could be thrown at targets too, keeping weapon skills sharp during the months when they weren't needed for hunting or warfare. Much of the daily work we've discussed, spinning, weaving, carving, tool-making, could be done socially rather than in isolation. Women might gather at one household to spin together, their hands working automatically while they talked, combining productivity with social connection. The work got done, but it felt less tedious when you were doing it with company, when there was conversation and laughter and shared complaint about how much wool there still was to spin. Men might work together on larger projects, repairing a neighbour's plough, building a new sledge, working on boat repairs in preparation for spring. The work went faster with multiple hands, and the combination of physical activity and social interaction made winter more bearable. There was an element of competition too, men demonstrating their skills to each other, taking pride in their craftsmanship, earning respect through the quality of their work. Teaching and learning happened during these social work sessions. A woman who was particularly skilled at a specific weaving technique might demonstrate it to others. A man who had a clever solution to a common problem would share his knowledge. Skills and techniques spread through communities this way, through observation and demonstration, rather than through written instruction. The knowledge was practical, immediately applicable, and valued precisely because it made life easier or more efficient. The long winter wasn't entirely devoid of special occasions. The winter solstice, midwinter, the darkest point of the year, was marked with celebration, partly religious observance and partly desperate defiance of the darkness. This was when families might slaughter an animal they'd been saving, preparing a feast that was genuinely abundant by winter standards. The meat would be fresh rather than preserved, a luxury that made the extra fuel expenditure worthwhile. There might be special bread, honeymead if any remained, foods that were normally rationed carefully but could be enjoyed more freely on this special occasion. The midwinter feast served multiple purposes. It was a religious observance, honouring gods and ancestors with offerings and ceremonies. It was a social event, bringing the community together to eat and drink and celebrate survival so far. It was a psychological boost, a bright point in the darkness that reminded people that spring was coming, that the days would start getting longer now, even if the coldest weather was still ahead. And it was practical. Eating well once helped people endure the continued scarcity that followed. Other celebrations might mark births, marriages, deaths, the major life transitions that happened regardless of season. A wedding in winter was less common than in summer, but it happened, and when it did, the community would gather to celebrate, to witness, to reinforce social bonds through shared ritual. A birth was cause for cautious celebration, cautious because infant mortality was high and premature celebration seemed tempting of fate, but celebration nonetheless, because a new life was always remarkable. A death required community support for the grieving family, practical help as well as emotional support, because a household that lost a working adult was suddenly vulnerable and needed assistance to survive. Larger communities might have something like an alehouse, not a pub in the modern sense, but a place where people could gather, where ale or mead was available, where entertainment might be more organized than what happened in individual homes. This wasn't every village, and it certainly wasn't available to the most remote farms, but where such spaces existed, they served as crucial social hubs during winter. Men particularly would gather there, drinking moderately because excessive drunkenness was looked down upon, talking about whatever concerned them, weather, politics, plans for spring, gossip about neighbours. The ale itself was weak by modern standards, more nutritious than intoxicating, providing calories as much as alcohol. It was safer to drink than water in many cases, because the brewing process killed pathogens, and it had some vitamin content that made it actually beneficial in a limited winter diet. The social aspect was perhaps more important than the drink itself. Men needed spaces away from the close quarters of the Longhouse, places where they could be themselves without the constant presence of family. Women had fewer such outlets, their social lives more centered on the home and on visiting between homes. This wasn't fair by modern standards, but it was the reality of a culture where gender roles were quite strictly defined. Women's social time happened during work, during visits for specific purposes, during communal events where everyone gathered. The weaving or spinning sessions we mentioned earlier weren't just about productivity. They were about creating women's social space in a culture that didn't provide much of it otherwise. Close quarters and limited resources inevitably led to conflicts, arguments between neighbours, disputes over property or obligations, personal grudges that festered in the forced proximity of winter. These conflicts couldn't just be ignored, because everyone involved had to continue living in close community, so there were social mechanisms for resolution. Local leaders, whatever passed for authority in the area, maybe a particularly respected elder, maybe someone with an official title, would be called upon to mediate, to hear both sides, to propose solutions that both parties could accept. The goal wasn't always justice in an abstract sense. It was restoration of community peace. If Bjorn had a dispute with his neighbour Olaf about a property boundary or a borrowed tool that was never returned, the community needed them to resolve it so that they could continue to cooperate, because their mutual survival depended on cooperation. The mediator might suggest compensation, might propose a compromise, might simply shame one or both parties into backing down. Public opinion mattered enormously in a small community where reputation was valuable currency. Some conflicts couldn't be resolved immediately and would be postponed until the spring assembly, when more formal legal proceedings could happen. But postponing wasn't the same as forgetting. Both parties would spend the winter building their cases, talking to potential witnesses, gathering support. The conflict would be a source of ongoing tension, discussed endlessly by neighbors who took sides, who offered opinions, who generally made the dispute into entertainment because there wasn't much else to talk about during the long, dark months. Chapter 7. Health, Illness and Hygiene. Staying alive in the cold. The fragility of life. Let's be brutally honest about something. Viking peasants died of things that would be trivial in the modern world. A bad tooth infection could kill you. A simple cut that got infected could kill you. Pneumonia, influenza, food poisoning, childbirth complications. All of these were potentially fatal in a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without even a basic understanding of germ theory. Winter made all of these dangers worse because cold weakened the body, because close quarters in the Longhouse facilitated disease transmission, because resources for treating illness were limited. Bjorn and Astrid would have been acutely aware of this fragility. They'd seen siblings die, children die, neighbors die from causes that seemed random and inexplicable. The uncertainty was constant. You could be healthy one day and seriously ill the next, and whether you recovered or not seemed to have as much to do with luck as with anything else. This created a kind of fatalism, a recognition that some things were beyond human control, that you did your best and hoped the gods or fate or whatever powers govern such things would be favorable. Preventive healthcare, such as it was, focused on maintaining strength and avoiding obvious dangers. Eating adequately was preventive healthcare. Malnutrition weakened your resistance to disease and injury. Staying warm and dry was preventive healthcare. Hypothermia and frostbite were real dangers, and being chronically cold made you more susceptible to respiratory infections. Avoiding injury was preventive healthcare. Being careful with axes and knives, watching your footing on icy surfaces, not taking unnecessary risks because any injury could potentially become life-threatening. Common winter ailments. Respiratory infections were probably the most common winter health problem. People living in close quarters, breathing the same smoky air, sharing everything from eating utensils to sleeping spaces. This was an ideal environment for spreading colds, flu, and more serious respiratory diseases. Someone would start coughing, and within days half the household would be sick. Most of the time, people recovered after a miserable week or two, but sometimes a respiratory infection would develop into something more serious, bronchitis, pneumonia, and then survival became uncertain. The treatments available were limited, but not entirely ineffective. Steam inhalation, achieved by heating water with herbs and breathing the vapors, could help clear congested lungs. Certain herbal preparations, teas made from pine needles, for instance, or elecampane root, had genuine medicinal properties that could ease coughing and help fight infection. Keeping the patient warm and rested was recognized as important, though rest was relative when you lived in a one-room house with a dozen other people and animals. Frostbite was another common problem for anyone who had to work outside in severe cold. Fingers, toes, ears, nose, any exposed or inadequately protected extremity could freeze, the tissue dying from lack of blood flow. Mild frostbite was painful but recoverable. Severe frostbite meant losing digits or limbs, either through surgical amputation if you were lucky enough to have someone skilled enough to attempt it, or through gangrene and death if you weren't. The treatment for frostbite was gradual rewarming, definitely not the rubbing with snow that folk wisdom sometimes suggested, which actually caused more damage. Gastrointestinal problems were common, especially in late winter when stored food was at its oldest and most likely to be contaminated or spoiled. Food poisoning, parasites, vitamin deficiencies that caused digestive issues, all of these could make life miserable. Diarrhea was particularly dangerous because it caused dehydration and nutrient loss, and in a person who was already marginally nourished, this could quickly become life-threatening. The treatments were mostly supportive. Clear fluids, bland foods, rest. Though certain herbs like mint and chamomile were recognized as helpful for settling upset stomachs. Dental problems. Tooth problems deserve special mention because they were both common and potentially serious. Viking diet included a lot of coarse food. Bread that often contained grit from the grinding stones used to make flour, dried meat that required hard chewing, foods that wore down tooth enamel over time. By middle age, many people had significant tooth wear, cavities, abscesses, and there was very little that could be done about it beyond extraction, which meant grabbing the tooth with a tool and yanking it out, hopefully getting the whole tooth, including the root, without anesthetic beyond possibly some alcohol to dull the pain. A tooth infection could be surprisingly dangerous. An abscess that went untreated could spread to the jawbone, to the sinuses, even to the brain, causing sepsis and death. People died from tooth infections with disturbing regularity, and the symptoms, fever, swelling, intense pain, would have been recognized as serious even if the underlying mechanism wasn't understood. Prevention was basically limited to avoiding excessive wear and trying to keep your mouth reasonably clean, though without toothbrushes or toothpaste, clean was relative. Some people had their mouths naturally cleaned by their diet. Chewing on tough, fibrous foods actually helped scrape plaque off teeth to some degree. Others might chew on hazel twigs or other materials that had a mild abrasive effect. Rinsing the mouth with water or weak ale after eating was practiced by some people, though whether this was understood as dental hygiene or just general cleanliness is unclear. What is clear is that by the time people reached old age, for those lucky enough to reach old age, they'd often lost most of their teeth, requiring them to eat soft foods or foods that had been pre-chewed for them, which was not dignified but was necessary for survival. Injuries and wound care. Accidents happened with depressing regularity when you lived a life of physical labor, using sharp tools and working around large animals. Axe cuts, knife slips, crushing injuries from falling objects or kicking animals, burns from working around fire. All of these were occupational hazards of Viking peasant life. The immediate care of wounds was actually fairly sophisticated for the time, based on practical experience, even if the theoretical understanding was limited. Bleeding had to be stopped, obviously, through pressure and binding. The wound then needed to be cleaned, often with water that had been boiled, though whether this was understood as sterilization or just as proper preparation is debatable. Sometimes wounds were washed with ale or mead, the alcohol having some antiseptic effect, even if nobody understood why. Honey was sometimes applied to wounds, and modern research has confirmed that honey actually does have antimicrobial properties, so this wasn't just superstition. It was effective treatment based on empirical observation. After cleaning, the wound would be bound with clean linen or wool, changed regularly, monitored for signs of infection. The signs were understood even if the cause wasn't. Increasing pain, redness, swelling, heat, pus, fever all indicated that something was going wrong. If infection set in, there wasn't much that could be done except keep the wound clean, possibly apply various herbal poultices that might or might not help, and hope the body's own defenses would win the battle. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Broken bones were set using splints, straight pieces of wood bound to the limb to hold it in position while it healed. The success rate depended largely on how severe the break was and how well it could be aligned. A clean break in a long bone might heal well, leaving the person with full function. A compound fracture, where the bone broke through the skin, almost always became infected and often resulted in death. Amputations were performed when necessary, a crushed hand, a gangrenous foot. But these were desperate measures with high mortality rates from shock and infection. Hygiene practices. Now let's talk about cleanliness, because there's a persistent myth that medieval people were universally filthy and never bathed. And while Viking peasants certainly weren't as clean as modern people with running water and soap, they weren't as dirty as the stereotype suggests either. Bathing happened, though not daily or even weekly necessarily, using water that had been heated laboriously over the fire and brought to whatever space was designated for bathing. Sometimes a separate small building, sometimes just a screened-off area in the Longhouse. The water might be used by multiple people in succession, becoming progressively grimier. But even dirty water is better than no water for removing accumulated sweat and dirt. Soap existed, made from animal fat and wood ash, creating a basic lye soap that was harsh but effective. It wasn't pleasant stuff by modern standards. It could irritate skin. It didn't smell good. But it worked to remove grease and dirt. Some families might bathe once a month in winter, others less frequently, depending on fuel availability and how much effort they wanted to put into heating water. Hair care was part of hygiene routine. Combs made from bone or wood were used to keep hair detangled and to remove lice, which were a constant problem in a world where people lived in close quarters and shared bedding. Head lice weren't a sign of poor hygiene particularly. They were just a fact of life, something everyone dealt with. A nuisance that required constant vigilance but wasn't seen as shameful. Combing hair regularly, sometimes with combs dipped in oil or other substances believed to discourage lice, was a daily routine for most people. Hand washing happened more frequently than full bathing, especially before eating or after handling something particularly dirty. Water was precious, but a small amount used to rinse hands was considered worthwhile. Some families kept a bowl of water near the door for this purpose, refreshed periodically. The connection between cleanliness and health wasn't understood in modern terms. Nobody knew about germs. But people understood empirically that cleanliness was associated with well-being. That people who paid attention to hygiene generally fared better than those who didn't. Childbirth and women's health. Childbirth in winter presented particular challenges. The cold made everything harder, the close quarters of the Longhouse meant no privacy, and the limited resources meant complications could quickly become fatal. Astrid, if she were pregnant during winter, would have been cared for by other women in the community. Older women who'd given birth themselves, who had experience assisting at births, who knew what was normal and what was a sign of trouble. The birth itself would happen in the Longhouse, probably near the fire for warmth, with the labouring woman supported by attendants who provided physical and emotional support. Pain relief was minimal, maybe some herbal preparations, maybe alcohol, mostly just encouragement and distraction. The attendants would know techniques to help the baby through the birth canal, how to position the mother, when to push and when to wait. They'd seen enough births to recognize when things were going normally and when intervention was needed. Complications were terrifying because there was so little that could be done. A baby in breech position might be turned by skilled hands, but if that didn't work, the birth became extremely dangerous for both mother and child. Hemorrhaging after birth could be fatal within minutes, and the treatments available, pressure, certain herbs believed to help clot blood, cold compresses, were limited in effectiveness. Many women died in childbirth, and many babies died either during birth or in the days immediately after from infections or other complications. Those women who survived childbirth faced a recovery period that was recognized as important, but often cut short by necessity. Ideally, a new mother would rest for several days, letting her body recover, bonding with the baby, establishing breastfeeding. But in a peasant household, there was work that needed doing, and if the mother was the one who normally did it, that work would fall behind unless she resumed her duties. The compromise was usually that she'd do lighter work, would receive help from other women in the household or community, but would be back to some level of productivity within days rather than weeks. Mental health. We can't ignore the psychological toll of Viking winter life, even though mental health as a concept didn't exist in the modern sense. But people understood that some individuals struggled more than others with the darkness, the isolation, the monotony. They didn't have terms like seasonal affective disorder or depression, but they recognized the symptoms: lethargy, hopelessness, withdrawal, irritability. The responses were community-based, keeping the person engaged, making sure they weren't left alone too much, involving them in activities, sometimes a bit of tough love about the necessity of continuing to function regardless of how you felt. Suicide happened, though how frequently is impossible to know. Someone who was deeply despairing, who saw no hope, who felt themselves a burden on their family. That person might walk out into a blizzard and not come back, might hang themselves in an outbuilding, might find some other way to end their pain. The community's response to suicide was complicated, a mix of grief, understanding, sometimes anger at the person for giving up, sometimes self-recrimination for not doing more to help. It was understood as a serious failure, not just of the individual, but of the support systems that should have prevented it. Alcohol was available and was sometimes used to excess, though problem drinking was generally disapproved of. A man who drank himself into stupor regularly, who wasted resources on excessive alcohol consumption, who became violent or unreliable when drunk. That man would face social consequences, criticism from neighbors, potential legal action if his behavior became too disruptive. Moderate drinking was fine, even encouraged in social contexts, but losing control was seen as shameful, as weakness, as violation of the self-discipline that Viking culture valued. Chapter 8. Children and Family Dynamics. Growing up in the cold. Childhood in winter. Being a child in a Viking household during winter meant existing in a strange liminal state. You were both burden and resource, both protected and expected to contribute, both carefree and prematurely adult. Children as young as 5 or 6 would have had regular tasks and responsibilities, appropriate to their age and strength, because every pair of hands mattered when survival was a communal effort. But they were also recognized as children, as not yet fully formed humans who needed guidance and some degree of protection from the harshest realities of life. The very youngest children, infants and toddlers, were kept close to their mothers almost constantly during winter. Astrid would have carried her baby in a sling while she worked, keeping the child warm against her body, allowing her to continue her tasks while still providing care. This wasn't primarily about bonding, though bonding happened. It was practical necessity. An infant who got cold could die. An infant who was left unattended could get into the fire, could be stepped on by an animal, could encounter any number of dangers in the crowded Longhouse environment. So they stayed attached to their mothers, watching the world from that secure position, learning through observation long before they could participate. Toddlers were more mobile and therefore more problematic. They needed watching constantly because they had no understanding of danger but unlimited curiosity and mobility. The older children often served as watchers, keeping the little ones away from the fire, away from the animals, away from anything that could hurt them. This was both babysitting and education. The older children learning patience and responsibility, the younger children learning from their slightly older siblings and cousins. It wasn't always gentle or patient by modern standards. A toddler who repeatedly tried to touch the fire might be swatted or spoken to harshly. Immediate negative consequence, creating a lesson that words alone couldn't convey. Education through participation. By age 6 or 7, a child was expected to be useful, to contribute in meaningful ways to household functioning. This didn't mean child labour in the Victorian factory sense. It meant age-appropriate tasks that genuinely helped and that taught skills the child would need as an adult. A girl of this age might help her mother with spinning, learning to work the drop spindle with small hands that were actually quite suited to the fine motor control required. She'd help with food preparation, learning which plants were edible and which weren't, how to prepare different types of food, how to manage scarce resources. A boy of the same age might help his father with animal care, learning how to approach cows safely, how much to feed different animals, how to recognize signs of illness or distress. He'd help with firewood, carrying smaller pieces from the woodpile to the house, stacking them neatly, learning the difference between woods that burned hot and fast versus slow and steady. He'd practice with small tools, a child-sized axe or knife, learning techniques under supervision until he could be trusted to work independently. The education was entirely practical. There was no formal schooling, no books, no curriculum beyond what you needed to know to survive and prosper in this environment. Children learned by watching, by doing, by making mistakes and being corrected, by gradual accumulation of skills and knowledge. A child who paid attention, who was quick to learn, who demonstrated competence, that child earned increased responsibility and trust, moving up the hierarchy of tasks toward the more complex and important ones. Stories and songs served educational purposes too, transmitting cultural knowledge in forms that were easy to remember. A song about seasonal changes taught children when to expect different weather patterns. A story about a hero overcoming challenges taught values like courage and persistence. Genealogical recitations taught family history and social connections. It was all education, just not formalized or separated from daily life the way modern education is. Play and recreation. Despite the work expectations, children still found time for play, and that play served its own educational purposes, even when it didn't look like education. Wrestling and rough play among boys taught them physical skills, taught them to assess opponents, taught them pain tolerance and how to handle both victory and defeat. Girls playing house with dolls made from scraps of fabric weren't just being cute. They were rehearsing adult roles, practicing the domestic skills they'd need as women. Simple toys existed, carved wooden animals, small boats, dolls, balls made from scrap leather stuffed with wool. These weren't bought from stores. They were made by family members during quiet hours, gifts that represented affection and attention from parents who didn't have money to spend on purchased toys, but did have skills and materials. A father who carved a particularly nice horse for his son wasn't just making a toy. He was demonstrating affection, teaching carving skills through example, creating something that would be valued and treasured. Games that required no equipment were popular. Hiding games, chasing games, made-up contests and challenges. Children would play in the areas around the Longhouse when weather permitted, building snow forts, sledding down hills on whatever would slide, ice skating if bone skates were available. The play was often cold and sometimes dangerous by modern standards. Nobody was supervising constantly. Nobody was preventing reasonable risks. But children learned their own limits, learned to assess danger, learned physical competence through trial and error. Coming of age. The transition from childhood to adulthood wasn't marked by a single moment or ceremony so much as by gradual assumption of adult responsibilities. A boy might be considered adult when he could do a full day's work alongside the men, when he could be trusted with adult tools and adult tasks, when his voice deepened and his body filled out. A girl might be considered adult when she could manage a household on her own, when she'd begun menstruating, when she demonstrated the skills and maturity needed to be a wife and mother. This transition typically happened in the early to mid-teens, much younger than modern Western standards of adulthood. By 15 or 16, a young person might be married, might be running their own household, or be a key worker in someone else's. This wasn't because Viking culture didn't value childhood. It was because life expectancy was shorter, because you needed to start your productive adult life earlier in order to establish yourself, because labor was always needed and able bodies couldn't be wasted in extended adolescence. The expectations placed on young adults were high. A teenage girl might be managing cooking, textile production, and childcare for a household while also being pregnant herself. A teenage boy might be responsible for significant portions of the farm work, for making decisions about animal care and crop management, for representing the family in community affairs. Modern sensibilities might recoil at this, seeing it as robbing young people of their childhood. But in context, it was normal, expected, necessary for the continuation of society. Family hierarchy and relationships. The Viking household wasn't democratic. It was hierarchical, with clear structures of authority and responsibility. The head of household, typically the eldest adult male, had final authority on major decisions, though wise men consulted with their wives and other adult family members. The wife managed the household's internal operations, food stores, textile production, the work of children and any servants or thralls if the family had them. Below them in the hierarchy were adult children, younger siblings, elderly parents, other relatives who'd been incorporated into the household. Respect for elders was expected, enforced through both social pressure and sometimes physical discipline. A child who was disrespectful to parents or grandparents would be corrected swiftly, because such behavior threatened the social order that kept the household functioning. This doesn't mean affection didn't exist. Parents loved their children, children loved their parents. But affection existed within a framework of respect and obedience that was non-negotiable. Sibling relationships were complicated by age differences and gender roles. Older siblings had authority over younger ones and were expected to help raise them, creating relationships that were part parental, part peer. Brothers might be close companions, but also competitors for inheritance and status. Sisters might be allies or rivals depending on personality and circumstances. The close quarters of winter intensified all these relationships, for better or worse. You couldn't escape your siblings when you were all living in the same room. So you either learned to get along or you made everyone miserable. Loss and grief. Child mortality was high. Perhaps a third or more of children didn't survive to adulthood, dying from disease, accident, or the general fragility of young life in harsh conditions. Families expected to lose children, prepared themselves emotionally for the possibility, but that preparation didn't make the reality any less painful. A mother who lost a child grieved. A father who buried his son felt that loss. Siblings mourned their dead brother or sister. The grief was real, but couldn't be indulged for too long. Life continued. Work needed doing, and prolonged mourning was seen as potentially harmful, as dwelling on sorrow in a way that could pull others down. So there would be a period of acknowledged grief, a few days, perhaps a week, during which the bereaved were excused from some duties and given emotional support. But then they were expected to resume normal life, to continue functioning, to channel their grief into productive activity rather than letting it immobilize them. Children who lost parents faced an uncertain future. If they had adult siblings or extended family, they might be absorbed into those households, raised by uncles or aunts or older siblings. If not, they might be fostered out to other families, their labor traded for their upkeep, their childhood ending abruptly as they took on the role of servant or farmhand in someone else's household. Orphanhood wasn't rare, and communities had mechanisms for dealing with it, though the experience for the child was often harsh. A sudden loss of security and status that marked them for life. Affection and tenderness. But we shouldn't paint too bleak a picture. Despite the harshness, despite the expectations and the discipline, there was room for affection, for tenderness, for the simple love between parent and child. Bjorn might carve a toy for his daughter, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see her smile. Astrid might save a bit of honey to sweeten her son's porridge on his birthday, a small indulgence that showed she was thinking of him. Parents sang lullabies to their children, told them stories, held them when they were frightened or hurt, provided comfort and security within the limits of what was possible. Children learned that they were valued, not just for their labor but as human beings, as the future of the family and community. The physical affection might be less demonstrative than in modern Western culture. Vikings weren't known for overwrought emotional displays, but it was present in the daily care, in the teaching, in the sacrifices parents made to keep their children fed and warm and safe. A mother who gave her child the warmest spot by the fire while she sat in a colder location was showing love as clearly as any words could express. The goal of child-rearing was to produce competent, responsible adults who could carry on the family line and contribute to community welfare. But wrapped up in that practical goal was genuine care for the individual child, hope for their future, pride in their accomplishments. It was love expressed in practical terms, in a culture that valued action over words, but it was love nonetheless. And children generally understood themselves to be loved, even when that love came with high expectations and strict discipline. Chapter 9. Religious Observances and Superstitions. Faith in the Darkness. The Gods in Winter. Religion in the Viking world wasn't a Sunday morning affair, separate from daily life and tucked away in special buildings. It was woven into everything, into the rhythm of seasons, into the success or failure of crops, into survival itself. The gods weren't distant abstract concepts, they were real presences who could help or harm, who demanded respect and offerings, who needed to be considered in all major decisions. And winter, with its darkness and danger, its isolation and hardship, was a time when the gods felt particularly close, particularly relevant to the daily struggle of staying alive. Thor, the god associated with farmers and common people, with thunder and protection, would have been particularly important to a family like Bjorn's. Thor was the god who fought giants, who protected Midgard, the world of humans, from chaos and destruction. In winter, when the forces of cold and darkness seemed overwhelming, when survival felt like a battle against nature itself, Thor's strength and protection were invoked regularly. A farmer might make a small offering to Thor before venturing out into a storm, might wear a hammer amulet for protection, might speak a prayer for safe return. Odin, the All-Father, the god of wisdom and poetry and death, was more distant, more complex. Perhaps less immediately relevant to daily peasant concerns, but still important. Odin was associated with the wild hunt, with the spirits of the dead riding across winter skies, with knowledge both sacred and dangerous. Stories about Odin would be told during the long winter nights, stories about his sacrifices for wisdom, about his ravens that flew across the world gathering information, about his role as the chooser of the slain who decided which warriors went to Valhalla. Freya and Freya, associated with fertility and abundance, with the prosperity of fields and herds, were honored even in winter because spring would come eventually, and their favor would be needed then. Offerings might be made to ensure their goodwill, to ask that they remember this household when the time came for planting, that they bless the animals with fertility in the breeding season ahead. The prayers and offerings weren't desperate begging, they were more like maintaining good relationships with powerful figures who could choose to help or not help as they saw fit. Household spirits and local powers. Beyond the major gods were countless smaller spirits and powers that inhabited the landscape, the household, the everyday world. The Landvatir, land spirits, lived in rocks, trees, streams, hills, and needed to be respected lest they caused trouble. A farmer didn't just own his land in the modern sense. He lived on land that had its own spiritual inhabitants, and maintaining good relationships with them was part of successful farming. This might mean leaving small offerings at significant landscape features, might mean avoiding certain areas known to be particularly sacred or dangerous, might mean speaking respectfully about the spirits and never insulting them. The house spirit, sometimes called a tomte in later folklore, was believed to inhabit the homestead itself, watching over the family and animals, helping with work if properly respected, causing mischief or worse if offended. This spirit might be left offerings of food, particularly during winter when the family ate their own meals, a bowl of porridge set out overnight, milk poured in a corner, bread left on a particular stone. These weren't grand ceremonies, they were small acknowledgements, ways of saying, "We see you, we respect you, please continue to help us." The barn and storage areas had their own spiritual significance. The animals were under the protection of various powers, and maintaining their health and productivity required more than just physical care. Protective symbols might be carved into beams, certain rituals performed at specific times of year. Traditional practices followed because that's what had always been done, and breaking tradition invited disaster. Whether these practices actually did anything in a physical sense didn't particularly matter. What mattered was that they maintained the proper relationship between humans and the spiritual forces that govern their world. Winter solstice celebrations. The winter solstice, midwinter, the longest night of the year, was the most significant religious observance of the winter season. This was Yule, a celebration that marked the turning point of winter, the moment when the sun began its slow return, even though the coldest weather was still ahead. The celebration combined religious observance, community gathering, and psychological necessity, a bright point of warmth and abundance in the middle of cold and scarcity. Preparations for Yule would begin days in advance. The Longhouse would be cleaned as thoroughly as possible, sweeping out accumulated dirt and debris, replacing old floor rushes with fresh ones if available, making the space as presentable as circumstances allowed. Special food would be prepared. An animal might be slaughtered specifically for the feast. Bread would be baked. Whatever special treats the family could afford or had been saving would be brought out. This wasn't everyday eating. This was celebration, abundance, defiance of winter's deprivation. The religious aspects of Yule involved offerings to the gods and ancestors. A portion of the feast would be set aside as sacrifice, perhaps burned in the fire, perhaps left outdoors in a sacred location, given to the powers in exchange for their continued favor. Toasts would be drunk to Odin, to Thor, to Freya, to the ancestors who had died but were still part of the family, still watching over the living. These weren't casual toasts, they were ritual acts performed with intention and respect, words spoken that had been spoken by ancestors for generations, maintaining continuity across time. The Yule log deserves special mention, a particularly large log, often oak, that would be brought into the house with ceremony and set to burn in the fire. This log was supposed to burn throughout the Yule celebration, its light and heat symbolic of the returning sun, its ashes later scattered on the fields for blessing and fertility. The selection of the log, the bringing it inside, the lighting of it, all of these had ritual significance. Traditional ways they were supposed to be done, words that were supposed to be spoken. Deviation from tradition was risky, potentially offensive to the powers being honored. Divination and fortune-telling. Winter was also a time for attempting to see the future, to gain some insight into what the coming year would bring. Various forms of divination were practiced, some more formalized than others. Runes might be cast, the patterns interpreted by someone with knowledge of their meanings, trying to read in the fall of carved stones what fate had in store. The practice was taken seriously. These weren't party games, they were attempts to access genuine knowledge, to plan appropriately for what was coming. Dreams during the Yule season were considered particularly significant, potentially prophetic, worthy of careful analysis and discussion. If Bjorn had a vivid dream during the midwinter period, he'd tell it to Astrid and others, and they'd collectively work through what it might mean, what warnings or promises it might contain. Some dreams were clear. Dreaming of abundant harvest obviously predicted good crops, but others were symbolic, requiring interpretation, and there were people in most communities who had particular skill at dream reading. Other divination methods were more physical. The shoulder blade of a sheep or other animal might be examined after the meat was eaten, the patterns of cracks and marks interpreted as messages. The behavior of animals on specific days could be significant. If the rooster crowed at an unusual time, if a cow acted strangely, these weren't random events but potential omens. The first person to enter the house on Yule morning, the first words spoken, the weather patterns on certain key days. All of these could be significant, could tell you something about what was coming. Protective magic and charms. Beyond religious observance and divination, there was a whole realm of protective magic. Practical spells and charms meant to ward off harm and encourage good fortune. These weren't separate from religion exactly. They were parallel to it. Another way of trying to influence the spiritual forces that govern the world. Some of these practices were old, predating the Viking Age by centuries. Folk magic passed down through generations with origins lost to memory. Protective symbols would be carved or painted in significant locations, above doorways, on barn beams, on storage containers. Some of these symbols we can still recognize. The Thor's hammer was common, representing the god's protection. Others are more mysterious, geometric patterns or stylized figures whose meaning has been lost. What matters is that people believed they worked, that they provided genuine protection against malevolent forces, and so they continued to be used generation after generation. Herbs and plants had magical as well as medicinal uses. Certain plants hung in the house drove away evil spirits or bad luck. Others, when carried on your person, provided protection during travel. Still others could be used in spells, to heal, to harm, to influence someone's feelings, to find lost objects. The knowledge of which plants had which properties, and how to use them properly, was specialized knowledge, often held by older women who'd learned from their own mothers and grandmothers, who served as informal magical practitioners for their communities. Words had power too. Certain phrases, spoken in the right way at the right time, could bless or curse, could bind or release, could compel or repel. A mother might speak words of protection over her children before they went outside. Invisible armor made of sound and intention. A farmer might curse someone who'd wronged him, not with a dramatic ceremony, but with specific words spoken with genuine feeling, trusting that the power in the words would carry his intention into reality. Whether these verbal spells actually worked is less important than the fact that people believed they worked and shaped their behavior accordingly. Ghosts and the restless dead. Winter, with its long, dark nights, was prime time for stories about the dead who didn't rest peacefully, who walked the earth causing trouble for the living. The Vikings believed that the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thinner at certain times and in certain places, and winter darkness was one of those times. A person who died badly, in violence, in despair, with unfinished business, might not stay peacefully in their grave, but might return as a drauga, a revenant that possessed physical substance and could do real harm. The stories about drauga were told around winter fires, tales meant to entertain but also to educate, to warn about the dangers of crossing certain boundaries, of violating certain taboos. A drauga might guard treasure, might harass former enemies, might simply wander causing mischief or worse. They had to be dealt with properly, sometimes through physical confrontation, digging up the body and destroying it or reburying it in a way that kept it contained. Other times through magical means, spells that could bind the dead or force them to rest. Other supernatural beings were active in winter as well. The trolls and giants of mythology weren't just story characters. They were real dangers, or at least people believed they were, which amounts to the same thing in terms of behavior. You didn't go certain places at certain times because trolls were known to frequent those areas. You didn't insult or offend them because they could retaliate. You took precautions, followed the rules, stayed within the boundaries of safety that tradition had established. The role of the vulva. Some communities had access to a vulva, a female spiritual practitioner who served as seer, healer, and intermediary with the spirit world. These women had specialized knowledge and abilities, gained through training and perhaps through innate talent that set them apart from ordinary people. During winter, a vulva might travel from farmstead to farmstead, performing services in exchange for hospitality and payment, telling fortunes, healing illnesses, performing protective magic, communicating with the dead. The arrival of a vulva was significant. The household would welcome her with the best food and accommodation they could provide, because her services were valuable, and because offending someone with her powers would be foolish. She might perform seidr, a form of magic that involved trance and spirit communication, singing special songs that allowed her to see things hidden from normal sight, to travel in spirit to distant places, to gain knowledge that couldn't be obtained through ordinary means. The respect given to a vulva was complicated. She was valued for her abilities, but also somewhat feared, kept at a slight social distance, marked as different and potentially dangerous. Her knowledge was needed, but also unsettling. Her power useful, but also threatening to normal social hierarchies. A vulva couldn't be controlled by the usual mechanisms of social pressure and authority. She operated according to her own rules, accountable to the spirits she worked with rather than to human authority. This made her both essential and problematic, respected and distrusted in equal measure. Christianity's slow infiltration. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Christianity was beginning to penetrate Scandinavia, though the process was slow and uneven, more successful in some areas than others. A family like Bjorn's might have heard about the Christian God, might have encountered Christian merchants or missionaries, might have even adopted some Christian practices without fully abandoning the old religion. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was pragmatic hedging of bets, accumulating as many divine protections as possible. Some people wore both Thor's hammer and a cross, covering their bases, ensuring they had the favor of both the old gods and the new one. Christian prayers might be spoken alongside pagan ones, Christian saints invoked in addition to the traditional powers. The boundaries between religions weren't as sharp for ordinary people as they were for theologians and kings. What mattered was what worked, what provided protection and help. And if that meant borrowing from multiple traditions, so be it. The full conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity would take centuries and would involve significant conflict and coercion. Kings would mandate Christianity, would destroy pagan temples, would execute or exile those who refused to convert. But in the early stages, during the period we're discussing, the religious landscape was mixed, fluid, a patchwork of old and new beliefs coexisting in various combinations. Bjorn might sacrifice to Thor on one occasion and pray to Christ on another, seeing no contradiction because both were powerful figures who might help him survive the winter. Chapter 10. The transition to spring. The long wait ends. The first signs. Spring didn't arrive as a single event, a switch flipping from winter to warmth. It came gradually, tentatively, a slow accumulation of small changes that might be barely noticeable at first, but that gathered momentum until one day you realized that yes, winter was actually ending. Spring was actually coming. You'd made it through another year. The first signs were subtle, the days getting longer at a pace that was now noticeable rather than theoretical, the angle of the sun changing so that its weak light had slightly more warmth to it, the behavior of birds beginning to shift. Bjorn would have been watching for these signs with the attention of someone who desperately wanted to believe they were real, but who'd been disappointed by false springs before. That slightly warmer afternoon in late February or early March, was it the beginning of real change or just a temporary fluctuation that would be followed by more weeks of cold? The patch of snow that had melted on the south side of the storage shed, was that meaningful or just local variation? The crow that had started making different sounds, was it responding to seasonal change or just being noisy for unrelated reasons? The careful observer could track the changes day by day. The icicles on the roof edge were dripping now, during the warmest part of the afternoon, before refreezing at night. The snow was starting to compact, getting heavier and wetter rather than light and fluffy. The animals seemed slightly more energetic, restless in a way they hadn't been during the depths of winter. The air smelled different somehow, less harsh, carrying hints of earth and moisture rather than just pure cold. These weren't dramatic changes, but they were changes, and after months of unchanging winter, any change felt significant. Late winter challenges. Paradoxically, late winter was often the hardest part of the whole season, even though spring was approaching. This was when food stores were at their lowest, when the variety of diet had shrunk to whatever could still be preserved, when everyone was tired of turnips and dried fish and wanted fresh food so badly they could taste it. The grain supply would be carefully rationed now, Astrid measuring out each day's portion with increasing anxiety, doing the math in her head constantly. How much left? How many days until planting? Would they make it, or would they run short? The animals were in poor condition too. The hay supply was running low, and what remained was often the poorest quality stuff, the last of the harvest that had been saved because it wasn't good enough to feed earlier. The cows were thin, their milk production down to a trickle or stopped entirely, their bones visible under winter coats that looked increasingly ragged. The chickens had stopped laying almost completely, saving their energy for survival rather than production. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was tired. Everyone was ready for winter to be over, and yet it persisted, week after week, seemingly endless. This was also when illness tended to strike hardest. People weakened by months of limited diet, stressed by cold and proximity, worn down by the constant effort of survival. They became more vulnerable to disease right when they most needed to stay healthy. A respiratory infection that would have been merely annoying in autumn could be serious or even fatal now. An injury that would have healed easily earlier in winter might not heal properly now that the body's resources were depleted. The community watched anxiously as people fell ill, hoping they'd recover, making what preparations they could for the possibility that they wouldn't. Psychological endurance. The psychological challenge of late winter was perhaps worse than the physical one. You'd endured months of hardship, you could see the end approaching, and yet you still had to continue enduring. Couldn't relax yet, couldn't let down your guard. It was like running a race where you could see the finish line, but it never seemed to get closer. Where every step forward was effortful, and you were so tired but stopping wasn't an option. People's tempers were short. Arguments that would have been brushed off earlier in winter now escalated into serious conflicts. The patience for children's noise and energy was exhausted. The small irritations of communal living that had been tolerable in November were intolerable in March. Bjorn and Astrid would have had to work consciously to maintain household peace during this period. Recognizing that everyone was stretched thin, that nerves were frayed, that small provocations could explode into major problems. Choosing not to engage in arguments that didn't really matter, giving each other space as much as possible in the confined quarters. Reminding themselves and their children that this was temporary, that it would end, that they just had to hold on a little longer. Not everyone managed this successfully. Some households descended into bitter feuding that would outlast the winter itself, creating rifts that might take years to heal. The boredom was crushing too. Everything that could be said had been said. Every story told and retold, every task done and redone until it was automatic and mind-numbing. The enforced inactivity, because venturing outside was still often dangerous and unpleasant, left people restless and irritable. Children were desperate for space to run and play. Adults wanted to be able to work outside, to see progress, to engage in the productive labor of farming rather than the maintenance work that had occupied winter. The anticipation of spring was almost painful, a longing so intense it was physical, a need to be done with winter that bordered on desperation, preparing for activity. Despite the continued cold, preparations for spring work had to begin before the actual thaw. Tools needed to be checked, repaired if necessary, sharpened and made ready. Ploughs that had sat idle since autumn needed to be examined. Were the blades still good? Were the handles solid? Did any parts need replacement? Seeds that had been saved from last year's harvest needed to be sorted, the best quality set aside for planting, damaged or mouldy seeds discarded. Plans needed to be made about what to plant where, how to rotate crops, what needed to be prioritized. Fences would need repair once the ground thawed enough to work with. Winter storms and ice damage would have taken their toll, and animals couldn't be turned out to pasture until the fences were secure. Bjorn would have been mentally cataloguing the work that needed doing, prioritizing it, thinking through the sequence of tasks. First, the fields needed ploughing, but before that, the plough needed repair. But before that, you needed to acquire the materials for the repair if you didn't have them on hand, which meant trade or bartering, which meant assessing what you had available to trade. Everything connected to everything else in a web of dependencies that required planning and foresight to navigate successfully. The social preparations were important too. Who would help whom with ploughing? Who owed labor to whom from previous exchanges? Which community projects needed organizing, maintaining common grazing areas, repairing shared infrastructure like bridges or paths, organizing the communal defense if raids were expected? These discussions would happen during the late winter visits, people making agreements, confirming obligations, coordinating their efforts for the busy season ahead. A farmer who tried to go it entirely alone would struggle. Successful farming required community cooperation, especially for the big tasks that needed multiple people. The ice breaking. The literal breaking of ice marked a significant transition. When the ice on rivers and lakes began to crack and break up, it meant that water was flowing freely again, that the freeze was truly ending, that spring was real rather than wishful thinking. The sound of ice breaking, deep cracks and groans, sometimes sudden loud reports like thunder, would have been music to people who'd spent months in frozen stillness. Water means life, means movement, means the world waking up from its frozen sleep. The ice breakup could also be dramatic and occasionally dangerous. Large chunks of ice moving downstream could damage anything in their path. Fishing weirs, boat docks, bridges. People would watch the rivers carefully during this period, both in appreciation of the spectacle and in concern for their property. Sometimes ice jams would form where the flowing ice piled up against some obstacle, creating temporary dams that could cause flooding when they eventually broke. The spring thaw brought its own hazards, even as it brought relief from winter. Melting snow created temporary streams and swamps, turning familiar landscape into a muddy, sodden mess that was difficult to navigate. Paths disappeared underwater or became impassable mud. The Longhouse might develop leaks as meltwater found its way through the turf roof. The winter's accumulated waste, manure, garbage, everything that had been dumped outside and covered by snow was revealed in soggy, smelly glory. It wasn't a beautiful process, this transition from winter to spring. It was wet and muddy and often unpleasant, but it was progress. It was change, and that made it wonderful despite the mess. The return of birds. The return of migratory birds was perhaps the most reliable and joyful sign that spring was truly coming. The geese that had left in autumn came back, their honking calls announcing their arrival. their V formations appearing in the sky like living proof that the world was renewing itself. Other birds followed, ducks, swans, smaller songbirds, each species returning at its appointed time, following migrations patterns established over thousands of years, fulfilling promises made by their departure months earlier. People watched for the birds with genuine emotion. Their return meant warmth was coming, meant food would be more abundant soon, meant the hard times were ending. Children would run outside when they heard the first geese, pointing and calling out, celebrating in the unself-conscious way of children for whom each spring is new and miraculous. Adults felt relief, more than celebration perhaps, but relief so profound it was its own kind of joy. We made it. We survived. Here's the proof flying overhead. The behavior of resident birds changed too. Birds that had been quiet through winter began singing again, establishing territories, attracting mates, engaging in the elaborate business of continuing their species. The sound of birdsong in the morning, after months of relative silence, was startling and delightful. It meant the world was waking up. It meant that the cycle was continuing. It meant everything they'd endured had been worth it, because here was spring, arriving on schedule, reliable despite everything. First green growth. The appearance of the first green shoots pushing up through the last of the snow was almost sacramental in its significance. Grass beginning to grow again, early spring flowers, snowdrops, crocuses, blooming in sheltered spots, the first leaves appearing on early budding trees. Green, the colour that had been absent for so many months, was returning to the world. And with it came hope so intense it was almost painful. The land was alive again. Plants were growing again. The cycle of life was resuming after its long winter pause. Bjorn might walk his fields during this period, checking the soil, looking for signs of frost damage to any winter crops that had been planted in autumn, assessing drainage and planning where to focus his spring ploughing. But he'd also just be observing, taking in the return of life, feeling something like gratitude that he'd made it to see another spring. This wasn't religion exactly, though it had religious overtones. It was something more primal, more fundamental, a basic human response to the ending of hardship and the return of abundance. Early greens, wild plants that appeared before anything cultivated was ready, would be gathered eagerly. Dandelion leaves, nettle shoots, wild onions. Anything that was edible and fresh would be collected and consumed, both for the nutrition and for the pure joy of eating something that wasn't preserved, wasn't stored, wasn't months old. These wild greens tasted like spring, like life, like survival, and they were eaten with an appreciation that modern people with year-round access to fresh produce can barely comprehend. The first day outdoors. There would come a day, different for each household, but arriving for everyone eventually, when the weather was mild enough and the work urgent enough that the family could spend most of the day working outside. Not just venturing out from necessary tasks and then hurrying back to the warmth of the Longhouse, but actually being outside for hours, working in the weak spring sun, feeling warmth on your face and wind that didn't quite freeze exposed skin. That day was a liberation, a release from the prison that the Longhouse had become over the long winter months. The work was hard. Spring ploughing was exhausting physical labour, turning over soil that had been frozen for months, wrestling with plough and oxen, fighting mud and stones and the general cussedness of land that didn't want to be worked. But it was good work, productive work, work that was building towards something rather than just maintaining survival. Bjorn would have been sore by the end of that first day, muscles protesting after months of relative inactivity. But it would have been a satisfying soreness, the kind that came from meaningful labor, from progress, from doing what needed to be done to ensure next winter wouldn't be quite so desperate. The children would have been ecstatic, running around the farmyard, exploring areas they hadn't seen in months, burning off energy that had been building up all winter, making noise without being shushed, because they were outside now where noise didn't matter so much. Astrid would have brought the textile work outside, sitting in the sun while she spun, letting the warmth soak into bones that had been cold for so long, enjoying the simple pleasure of being able to see clearly by natural light, rather than squinting in the smoky dimness of the indoor fire. Looking forward and back. As spring established itself, as the routine of winter gave way to the routine of the growing season, there would have been time to reflect on the winter that was ending. What had been learned? What had worked well, and what needed to be done differently next year? How close had they come to running out of food, and what did that mean for how much to preserve in the coming autumn? Who had helped them through difficult periods, and how could they repay those debts? Who had failed in their obligations, and how would that be addressed? Bjorn might take inventory of what the winter had cost: animals lost, tools broken, family members who'd been sick and hadn't quite recovered their strength. He'd balance that against what the winter had given: children who'd learned new skills, projects completed during the idle months, social bonds strengthened through shared hardship. Winter was never purely negative, even at its worst. There were always small victories, always moments of joy or connection or accomplishment that made it bearable, that made survival worthwhile. And there was the simple fact of survival itself, which was no small thing. They'd made it. The family was intact, the household was functioning, the animals had survived, the seed grain was preserved, and now they had another chance to grow food, to build security, to prepare for the next winter that would inevitably come. Each spring was a renewal not just of the land but of hope, of determination, of the fundamental human stubbornness that refuses to give up even when giving up would be easier. The cycle would continue, planting and growing, harvest and preservation, another winter of endurance, another spring of renewal. This was the rhythm of Viking peasant life, unchanging across generations, a pattern so old and fundamental it seemed almost natural, almost inevitable. And in that rhythm, in that cycle, there was a kind of security, a knowledge that whatever happened, the seasons would continue their progression. Spring would always follow winter. Life would persist despite hardship. It wasn't a comfortable life. It wasn't an easy life. But it was life, and they'd mastered the art of living it. And so, as we reach the end of tonight's journey through Viking winter survival, we're reminded that the history we think we know, the raiders and warriors, the dramatic battles and legendary heroes, was built on a foundation of ordinary people doing ordinary things extraordinarily well. Bjorn and Astrid, the peasant farmer and his wife we followed through these long winter months, weren't heroes in the saga sense, but they were heroes in the truest sense. People who faced genuine hardship with competence and resilience, who maintained their humanity and community bonds under conditions that tested both, who passed on skills and knowledge and values to the next generation, ensuring that life would continue. Their winter survival wasn't about any single dramatic moment. It was about 1,000 small decisions made correctly, about routines maintained even when maintaining them required effort and discipline, about planning ahead and preparing properly, and then having the endurance to follow through when the cold and dark seemed endless. It was about understanding that survival was a communal effort, that no individual or household could make it entirely alone, that the bonds between people were as important as the walls of the Longhouse or the food in storage. These weren't just Vikings in a textbook. They were real people, facing real challenges, living lives both remarkably different and surprisingly similar to our own. They worried about their children. They worked to maintain their relationships. They took pride in their skills. They found joy in small pleasures. They endured hardship with determination, and they looked forward to better times ahead. The specific challenges they faced were different from ours, but the fundamental human experiences, love and loss, work and rest, hope and fear, connection and isolation, those are universal across time and culture. Their methods of surviving winter, the layered clothing and careful food preservation, the communal support and practical skills, the religious faith and superstitious practices, might seem primitive to us with our modern technology, but they worked. Generation after generation survived harsh Scandinavian winters using these techniques, raised families, built communities, created a civilization that would eventually spread across Europe and beyond. Their success is testified to by the simple fact that we're here talking about them 1,000 years later. I hope this brought you some peace tonight, maybe taught you something new about how humans have survived in harsh conditions, or at least gave you a comfortable place to rest your mind while imagining a life very different from your own. The next time you're cold, the next time you're dealing with winter weather, maybe spare a thought for Bjorn and Astrid, dealing with winter without central heating, without grocery stores, without any of the conveniences we take for granted. It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.